Music has always evolved through reinterpretations of ideas that came before. Every genre that exists has deeply connected roots of influences from all around the world, with each new subgenre building on previous concepts to create something unique. Sampling is a contemporary art form that fully embraces this aspect of music, as it involves directly taking segments from someone else's recording and incorporating it as part of your own. While this is a relatively new way to create music, sampling has existed for decades in various forms, such as classical composers reworking each other's melodies, or jazz musicians improvising well-known hooks into their live shows, as a homage to the original composer. The first usage of recorded sampling occurred in the early 1940s with Music Concrete, an experimental form of sound manipulation where pre-recorded samples were altered through a tape recorder in ways such as looping, pitch shifting, and tempo changing. These techniques would later influence bands like the Beatles, and Pink Floyd. In 1946, an American inventor called Harry Chamberlain invented the very first sampler, which he named the Chamberlain. That's creative. It worked via an electrical mechanical keyboard, which triggered tape loops of a variety of sounds for up to 8 seconds. While the instrument began as somewhat of a novelty, in 1962 a small electronics company in Birmingham produced a refined clone model called the Mellotron and adopted better marketing strategies. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the instrument had become heavily associated with pop and progressive rock artists, such as This is ground control to Major Tom, and many more. Although, despite the success of the Mellotron, sampling was still very much in its infancy and considered experimental. However, it didn't take long for it to develop within an emerging genre. Throughout history, music has always been instrumental in the rise of rebellious countercultural youth movements that challenged the values of previous generations. During the 70s, punk rose into the mainstream as the dominant voice speaking out against social conditions within Europe at the time. However, within the Bronx borough of New York, small neighborhood block parties were becoming a catalyst for an equally impactful underground movement challenging the same thing: hip-hop. These events celebrated music by black artists that wasn't played on the radio and utilised very limited equipment available at the time, such as basic mixers, microphones, and most importantly, turntables. It's widely accepted that the birth of the genre came from one particular back-to-school jam on the 11th of August 1973 at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, when a DJ named Kool Herc realised that crowds were responding the most to moments within records where only drum beats were playing, otherwise known as breaks. He then discovered that a break could be extended by switching between 2 copies of the same record on a turntable, letting one play out a specific part while queuing up the other to the start of the same part. Popular breaks during this time, such as have since appeared in thousands of tracks, influencing many genres like electronic music and pop.
Don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years. I'm rocking my pants, putting suckers in fear. MC Ren, will you please give your testimony to the jury about this fucked up incident?
A dude wrote my dog from Pelican Bay. The letters say, Nas, I got your back, the fools don't play.
The most sampled piece of music to this day is the Amen break, a 6-second drum solo from an obscure 1960s B-side track by the Winstons called Amen Brother. As hip-hop began to take shape, technology also began to rapidly evolve. The first commercially available sampling synthesizer was the 1976 Music Melodeon, although the machine's price and rarity meant most people at the time didn't have access to one. Stevie Wonder used it on his 1979 album Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants, which is believed to be the first record to extensively use samples, closely followed by 2 other albums in 1981. 1979 also saw the release of the revolutionary Fairlight CMI, which not only became the first purchasable digital polyphonic sampler, but additionally featured a built-in synthesizer and a digital audio workstation, all in one, controlled with a light pen. The term sampling is also credited to the machine's creators, Peter Vogel and Kim Rury, when they were demonstrating the machine's capabilities. Another important record that debuted in 1979 was the Sugarhill Gang's Rapper's Delight, also known as the very first hip-hop record, arriving 6 years after the genre's inception. As the technology wasn't yet available to make the record sound like it would have done at parties, the title track samples Chic's Good Times, but utilizes a live band as opposed to a direct sample. However, it only took a year for this to change once samples were introduced to drum machines. In 1980, Roger Lynn released the Lynn LM1 computer, which was one of the first programmable drum machines and the first to use samples of real acoustic drums, although this was quickly succeeded in 1982 by the superior Lynn drum. The most popular drum machine at the time was the 1980 Roland TR-808 Rhythm Composer. Unlike the Lynn series, the 808 generated sounds using analog synthesis as opposed to playing direct samples. The 808 became hugely influential in the development of hip-hop, electronic, and pop music through to the mid-80s, where improved and more affordable options such as the 1985 EMU SP12 and the infamous 1987 EMU SP1200 became available. These drum machines also had a built-in function that allowed users to sample directly from records, meaning DJs could now incorporate breaks back into their music in combination with other samples and the sounds generated from analog drum machines. The most revolutionary aspect about these samplers was that now compositions could be created entirely within the machines, meaning studios were no longer necessary for making a track. Arguably the biggest innovation came shortly after in 1988, where Roger Lynn designed the first in the MPC series, the Akai MPC-60. This groundbreaking sampler combined sequencing and sampling features into a single box that could be played like an instrument using a 4x4 grid of touch-sensitive pads, each able to hold samples up to 13 seconds long. DJ Shadow's 1996 album, Introducing, used an Akai MPC-60 to create the very first record made entirely out of samples. The MPC has also allowed artists like J Dilla, Daft Punk, and Kanye West to pioneer new ways of chopping, lifting, and tweaking samples, completely reinventing the sound and possibilities of existing genres such as hip-hop, electronic music, and pop. To this day, Akai keeps on releasing new MPCs, and they are considered a standard in DJ technology alongside turntables. Sampling hasn't come without its issues though. When sampling really started taking off around the late 80s and artists were given the ability to sample whatever they wanted, many started taking segments from pre-existing music without gaining proper clearance. Although, because there were no laws in place at the time stating you had to get permission, sampling became somewhat of a legal grey area. Record companies and their associated artists saw hip-hop albums like the Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique, which used over 300 samples, and sued them on the basis that sampling wasn't creative and instead just blatant stealing. A notable case was De La Soul's 1989 seminal record 3 Feet High and Rising. The track Transmitting Live from Mars contained a 12-second sample from the Turtles' 1969 song You Showed Me, and they were sued for $2.5 million in 1991, even though the original sample had been altered. In the end, the dispute was settled outside of court for $1.7 million, setting a dangerous precedent for producers if they got caught. The most infamous case was Grand Upright Music Limited versus Warner Bros. Records Incorporated, which occurred within court when Biz Markie sampled music from Gilbert O'Sullivan for his track Alone Again on his 1991 album I Need a Haircut. Gilbert O'Sullivan sued Biz Markie and his record label, winning the case when the court ruled that sampling without permission constitutes copyright infringement. Following this, producers came up with 4 ways to avoid costly licensing fees. The first was to hire studio musicians to replicate selected passages of music and sampling their recording, meaning producers only had to pay publishing and songwriting fees, and not any mechanical and recording fees, which were usually more expensive. The next was to chop and flip a sample beyond recognition and hoping that the owner of the master rights wouldn't be able to notice. Another way was to avoid sampling the music of entire catalogues, record labels, or artists, because certain artists like the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and Prince always refuse requests for licensing. And the last way was to sample from artists that they personally know or have worked with before. Despite all this, if a producer still couldn't clear a sample, they'd be forced to either abandon the track or rework it with different samples. Past 1991, artists became somewhat limited by what their record labels could afford to license, meaning less samples could be used in their music. However, the drawback meant that each sample from then on would be a lot more varied, meaning producers started developing their own musical styles, and the lines between existing genres started blending more and more. Nowadays things are a lot simpler because if you own a computer or a smartphone, you own a sampler. This means that regardless of any previous musical experience, just about anyone can create music with whatever samples they can think of. Likewise, digital audio workstations, or DAWs, software that allows you to record, mix and master music, are more accessible than ever. There are many free DAWs available such as GarageBand, Pro Tools First and Ableton Lite, which anyone can easily learn due to the endless tutorials available online, usually alongside a paid industry standard version like Logic Pro, Pro Tools and Ableton Live, which offer more features. All DAWs come with built-in simulations of hardware called VST plugins, meaning you can emulate any drum machine, synthesizer, or digital effect with a virtual interface as opposed to a specific physical machine. They also come with huge copyright-free sample libraries, allowing you to create sampled music easily without any extra hassle. There are also many websites that offer subscription fees in return for massive royalty-free sample libraries, which you can also sell your own samples on. Since 2019, one such service, TrackLib, has created annual blog posts called The State of Sampling, which tracks sampling trends and statistics of its popularity from Billboard. A few examples from the latest 2021 post shows 54% of new albums that were featured on Billboard's Top 25 in 2021 contained samples, with the average release date of the original samples being 1992, and breaks are being sampled far less often. There were only 2 clear drum break samples in all the songs on Billboard's Hot 100 charts in 2021, both coming from Tyler the Creator on his album Call Me If You Get Lost. It also highlighted how video platforms like TikTok are playing a huge role in the future of sampling by recontextualizing music into new works. Like sampling, TikTok revives the old, obscure, and classic songs to a new audience, as well as educating them on sample breakdowns and production tutorials. TrackLib claims that in total, these videos have gained well over 500 million views, demonstrating the wide appeal sampling has had to a new generation who will continue to sample into the future. For years, the music industry claimed that sampling takes no talent whatsoever and justified suing artists for millions because they transformed tiny snippets of other people's recordings. The Grammys even refused any song containing a pre-recorded sample to be eligible for Song of the Year until 2014. Despite this, sampling has managed to evolve from niche tape experiments to mainstream prominence throughout all genres, with artists continually building upon music from the past to create new innovative styles of music. However, even now there is no easy way to clear samples, so musicians are creatively limited in what they're able to release. Currently, the process of clearing a sample involves finding out who owns the rights to the sample, contacting them, and negotiating a price, making sure you get it in writing that they can license it to you. Although this can still be a complex and expensive endeavour, and an easier system should be enacted. Either way, the future of sampling looks bright, and with everyone able to sample whatever they want throughout various artistic mediums, who knows how it will evolve next in the years to come.